All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Erin Zilka. I am the owner and president of Kona Financial Planning and love the opportunity I've had to work with so many clients and helping them put together and build estate plans and really get a clearer picture of their total financial plans, making sure they have everything set up for themselves to achieve their goals and protect their loved ones. And here with me today is Brian Leitner. He is the head of Mariner Platform Solutions. He's an extension of my team. So thanks so much for being here today with me, Brian. You want to spend a couple minutes, tell everybody a little bit about yourself, and then we will jump into the estate planning presentation.
Erin, thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody taking some time out of their afternoon this afternoon. I won't bore anyone. I will just simply tell you that it's a pleasure to work with Erin and provide her support where needed. But frankly, she is a phenomenal planner. This is a conversation I think that isn't talked about enough. And frankly, a lot of individuals sort of put it off and put it off and put it off. And so I just appreciate the fact that, folks are here today to maybe embrace this conversation, learn a little bit more about it, and then hopefully take some sort of action if it requires it. And if it doesn't, and everyone's in great shape, I think you maybe sleep a little bit better tonight knowing that you're in great shape. But let's figure that out by having this conversation. And so, Erin, thank you so much for putting this together. I love it when you do events like this and educate. So,
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep, I'm excited to jump into this. So let's go ahead. I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started. So Brian, why don't we start out? I know one of the first questions a lot of people have is, what do I mean when I say estate planning? What exactly does that entail? What do I need to consider? So let's just start with a very basic definition. You want to jump into what exactly estate planning is and kind of what it means to you?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great one, and I can go on for quite some time on this. But just to talk about it, maybe at a high level, I think some folks think about it as who's going to get what and when after I'm no longer around. And I think that is one way to think about estate planning. And then there are estate planning strategies, right? How do I make sure that there isn't a whole lot of red tape? How do I make sure that I don't pay too much in taxes? How do I make sure that my beneficiaries or loved ones or charity, whoever that might be, actually take receipt of this without too much time going on? I mean, all of those sorts of things. Absolutely right. So I do think it is the distribution of assets. But I think it's also a lot more than that. It's ultimately deciding, what does that distribution look like? If you have, two children, do they split everything equally? Is it a bit more complicated when you have a business? Maybe one child wants to be in the business, another child doesn't. Are there assets that are, call it illiquid? So these are assets that aren't as easy to transfer as maybe cash. So think about maybe a building or your house, or ultimately what that looks like. And then I think about the person that's receiving these, because we don't necessarily know, most of the time, we don't necessarily know when this is going to happen. But giving yourself the ability to plan now and say, well, ultimately, will these individuals who may receive these assets, will they be ready to receive these assets, right? And if there's minors, there's certain laws that are put in place, and there's a lot that you can do from that perspective. But ultimately, that's one of the big gaps that I see. I see a lot of folks that'll put together comprehensive estate plans. Everything's fantastic.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, they haven't prepared their heirs, and they haven't transitioned some of the values. And they haven't said, listen, when you receive these assets, this is ultimately what I think you should do with them. And they can actually, create rules around that, or they can just simply have the conversation and educate them. And then there's different things that you can do to incentivize the right behavior. So there's so many different aspects, including, taxes and naming certain people that we're going to get into in a little bit. But the most important part, and I hope this is, if there's one takeaway, I'll get it over with now, is that oftentimes we speak to folks about estate planning, and somebody might say to me, hey, this was really informative. I'm going to go meet with an attorney. And I would tell you a next step in this process is not to meet with an attorney. It's not that you shouldn't meet with an attorney. It's just the order, if you will. And so what's critically important is that you have a real understanding, a comprehensive plan, as opposed to the end result in one area of your financial situation, because the reality is it is all integrated. So making sure that you follow the right process, if you will, because then ultimately you may be either making decisions and shooting from the hip and you don't know about it, or there just may be a few missteps. So big picture, that's what I think about when I think about estate planning.
Absolutely. I think that's a great explanation and really kind of kicks us off into talking a little bit more. You mentioned the process and who would be involved. Just, to your point, we asked the question then, who needs estate planning? And obviously, I think you and I, where we're sitting, we're going to say everyone, but the reality is, anytime you own an asset, you have something that has value to you, it is important to make sure that, like Brian said, not only you know exactly how that's going to be handled if you are gone, but also making sure that your heirs understand your wishes with that asset, with those valuables, whatever that may be. And also taking into consideration, estate planning does not just cover once you're gone, but also a very important part if you are not able to make, or you're not able to share your wishes with your loved ones. Say, unfortunately, something happens and you become incapacitated. You're unable to share that information or verbalize it with your loved ones or another planning professional, and you haven't put this stuff in writing. It leaves so much more difficulty for your loved ones, for your beneficiaries to figure out exactly what your wishes were and how something should be handled, not only with your estate and your assets, your financial assets, but also with your healthcare wishes and how you need things handled. If you're not able to make those decisions yourself, is the person who winds up being appointed to make those decisions comfortable with making those decisions? So depending on, the aspects that you want to cover, it can be as simple as making sure that you just have a basic will and maybe a healthcare power of attorney, all the way to the complexity level of having a series of trusts that are funded by life insurance policies. But making sure that you're having these conversations and just really getting a good plan together, making sure you understand how the process is going to work, and knowing that it applies to having plans in place really does apply to all of us. We work very hard in our lives and in our careers to build up the assets that we have and build up the estates that we wind up accumulating. And we want to know that those are going to be protected and handled in a way that supports our families and continues to help our loved ones, continue with the lives that we want them to have after we're gone, or if we're in a position to not really be able to help support ourselves that way anymore. So Brian mentioned then how we get started with this process. Like he said, don't just jump off, the cliff and say, all right, I'm going to go meet with an attorney. But one of the best things that you can do is sit down and have that conversation and really start taking an inventory of your financial assets. So this is where sitting down with your financial planner or a financial advisor of some sort, and the people that are going to be involved in this process with you, the entire estate planning process. So if it's you and a spouse, if it's you and your children, beginning by taking inventory of what you have and understanding exactly yourself, what you want to achieve, what goals you want to make sure that you accomplish. So for some clients, it's making sure that they have not only their family and their loved ones protected and provided for, but maybe also there's a charitable organization that is near and dear to your heart that you have been funding and supporting for almost a lifetime, and you want to make sure that you're continuing to fund those goals and fund those missions even after you're gone. There's so many different aspects that can be taken into consideration when you're trying to determine exactly how you want your estate to be handled. So begin by sitting down and taking an inventory, discussing those conversations. with your spouse or your loved one that's involved. I'm sure, Brian, I know that we've both had this happen many, many times. You sit down to have this conversation with a client, you're crossing the table from them, and one spouse thinks they have the exact idea and plan of how they want things handled. Maybe there's a particular sibling that they say, well, this is who's going to be the guardian of our children. If something happens to us, this is who we would designate as the person who's going to make our healthcare directive decisions. And then the spouses begin to talk and the other one says, well, that's not exactly who I had in mind. I'm not sure that's the most responsible sibling you have. And so it just, there's so many times I think that we run into this situation where we think we're on the same page with our partners. And then when you sit down and have the conversation, you realize maybe you're not exactly on the same train of thought as you thought you were. And so I think it just opens up that opportunity to delve deeper into the conversation. And then from there, we can help bring in the estate planning attorneys and the tax professionals to really make sure that we're not only putting the plans in place and putting everything in writing, but considering all the strategies and options that we have available and understanding any possible tax implications or any fees or expenses that might be charged to us or the estate or our beneficiaries, making sure that we're really looking at the implications of all those different options and strategies. Do you agree?
Without a doubt, well said, Erin. And there's a couple of things that you said that I just jotted down a couple of things. One of the things that you said was you wanted to make sure that people had this sort of squared away, if you will, well before should some sort of emergency happen. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. But, oftentimes I'll meet folks that will say, we've taken care of our burial plots or whatever those wishes are. And they joke a little bit, right, about death, because people joke about it instead of, sometimes they do in terms of speaking about it. And then they say, I have that taken care of, or I have this taken care of because I don't want to be a burden to someone. Well, the ironic part is a lot of these folks, once you start having a conversation about their final wishes as it relates to their assets or the distribution of those or what have you, they haven't taken care of a whole lot of things because the reality is they just don't know what the laws are. And every state is going to be different. And I think, there's an old adage that's out there in the wealth management business, and it's something to the extent of, if you don't have an estate plan, the government has one for you, both at the federal and at the state level.
Absolutely.
And it's right. It's really important that we understand that and can't have our head in the sand. I think about it like taxes too. And I know that, you're very knowledgeable in the tax area as well. When I think about the tax side of things, it's almost like the government wants you to take the default option, because the default option, whether it's in terms of income taxes or estate taxes, it's usually the option that's beneficial for them. And this isn't some sort of conspiracy theory. This is just it's sort of like, it's akin to, I don't know if there's any dentists on the line, but most people would tell you, if you're proactive with your dental care, you save yourself a lot of pain. Well, if you're proactive as it relates to your financial planning, it's the same thing. You're going to save yourself a lot of, not necessarily physical pain like the dentist perhaps, but you'll save yourself a great deal in taxes and grief. And that's part of the issue here, because most of the time when we see something go wrong, or we get a phone call from someone that's not a client of ours and they say, here's what just happened. When you think about the state that they're in, it's in distress, it's in grief. And we all know that as humans, we don't make great decisions when we're in that state. So a couple of things to think about there. The other thing that you mentioned, Erin, which is something I should have said earlier as it relates to what estate planning is, it's you just mentioned medical decisions. Well, so what's really important, and I know we're going to get to this, is if you're not able to make medical decisions on your behalf and you haven't been proactive there, again, the state's going to decide what's in your best interest as opposed to maybe a loved one. And I think that's really important. You mentioned guardians, and this happens all the time, just in social circles. And I'm the guy who probably maybe helps shed some light on this, but I hear it certainly when I was younger. oh, we've named, Joe and Sally the guardians of our kids. That's excellent. How'd you do that? Well, we just did it right now. That's it. You guys all hear it? That's what we want to do. And nothing's been filed the right way.
Yeah.
And it's not in their will. And worse, sometimes if things change and those people change, and if those things aren't updated, it's a real problem. So those are just, again, different things that I don't think most people think about, simply because it's not where they choose to spend their time.
Yeah.
But either way, it's just something they have to be knowledgeable about. And the more that we can share in that area, I think the better. So yeah, absolutely agree with you.
Yeah. And before we jump into the next slide here, you mentioned something, it just made me think about, even like we were talking about the healthcare, power of attorney and the person making that decision. And if we don't have someone designated, it does turn over to the state, and the court will actually you have to file a petition with the court. They will designate that healthcare person, the named person in that situation. And then the process becomes much more tedious and even more difficult for the person who has to make those decisions, because not only do they have to be appointed by the court, but they actually have to have a hearing to ensure that that person is capable of making those decisions. So they get put through a little bit more. And then they have to report back to the court periodically as well, just to give updates on decisions that are being made. And so there's so much more that if you don't have somebody specifically designated to make those decisions, involving the court in that entire process, I think just becomes more painful and more difficult for your loved one who really already has to take on that responsibility. So just a really good point, I think, to make there. Why don't we jump into talking about the actual legal documents? We keep talking about these little legal documents that we want to make sure we have drawn up. So what are some of those documents that we're referring to, Brian?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about those legal documents. So if we think about the first one, which is the last will and testament, again, that is effectively your will. And there's a whole host of reasons why you want to have this. It ultimately decides on where your assets are going to go. And that's a bit of a loaded statement, because there's a variety of different ways that assets pass to your loved ones, and we'll get to that. But that is your fundamental document that you need. And most people would say you need a pour over will, which effectively means that anything that was sort of left out of the will will pour into a revocable trust and so forth. And so that's critical. It's also going to name your guardians for your children where appropriate. And so again, any type of asset that you own that doesn't pass by contract or title or beneficiary, so think about personal assets passed by your last will and testament. Something else to think about here, this is a gap that I see quite a bit of. I was in a conversation with someone, this conversation was probably several months ago. I met with a husband and wife, and we had talked about their will. And I couldn't help but notice the woman in the meeting had this huge ring on, and it looked very expensive. And I'm not well versed in that, but I saw the shine, if you will, the bling. And I asked her, I said, listen, for a ring like that, can you tell me a little bit about it and how she got it? And we don't have to go into the details here, but I ultimately asked her what she's going to do with it. And she said that she was going to pass it down. And she has 3 boys, and they're all adult age, and they're all married. And I said, she's like, it's all in my will. And so I had her will in front of her. I had their will in front of me. And just as a sort of an eye opener for folks, there was nothing in that will that said this ring that was purchased, 15 years ago is going to go to this person. That's a personal asset. What the will actually says is that something to the extent of my personal assets will be split, a third. Right.
Yeah.
So what happens with that ring? And so from her perspective, it was ultimately sort of decided upon by the family that it was going to go to, I think, one of the granddaughters, who was very young at this point, by the way. So that's another conversation. There's nothing that documents that. And while we all hope that everyone's going to fulfill someone's wishes, Aaron, you know as well as I do that sometimes that doesn't happen, and there are people that will fight tooth and nail to make sure that things are seen their way.
Yep.
And in that sense, marrying the will with what's referred to as a personal property memorandum is just a really good idea. And that think about it as a Word document. And it'd say, this ring that I wear on my finger every day, or however you want to reference it, is going to go to Sally, my granddaughter. The kitchen table is going to go to this person. Aaron, I know you see this potentially even more often than I do, but what are your thoughts as it relates to fighting over some of these personal assets? I mean, what do you hear?
I mean, it's sad but true. We all like to think that our families are not the types of the families that are going to fight over things tooth and nail, but sometimes the most wonderful families I've seen get into kind of a bickering match over something that had sentimental value to one sibling as well as another, or there's value to another, and they feel that it needs to be sold and the money gets split three ways, or however many siblings they have. But it is something that I think the importance, is really just to make sure, write down as much as possible and make sure that you have as much in detail as you possibly can. I know it gets a little tedious, but especially with those more valuable items and some of the more sentimental or family heirlooms, it really just helps to make sure that you can limit some of that infighting that you really don't want to see your family go through after someone has passed. I think that there's just too many times when things are left to question. It creates a little too much confusion and difficulty. And, I've seen everything from clients who say, well, I'm walking around and I'm putting a Post-it note on the back of everything I own. And, the person's name is going to be on it. And that's how everything's going to be divided, to really having things nailed down into very strict rules and, restrictions within a trust. So, I mean, I've seen the whole gamut, as I'm sure you have also, but you just want to make sure that, if you have certain plans in mind, and also, if you can, make sure that you're having these conversations with your children, with your heirs, so they're also very well aware of what your wishes are, and they can honor those wishes when you're no longer there to share them. So.
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, communication, in my opinion, is half the battle, because a lot of folks, this isn't something that they want to talk about. I know that's something that you help folks talk about in terms of those family meetings and what have you. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And maybe I'll get to this in just a minute, but you had mentioned that you hope that they pass down these values and hope the kids follow them. And on the far right-hand side of the screen, we'll talk about trusts. And the reality is that there's a lot that you can control from the grave. And so maybe just to move further along, the power of attorney is important, when you think about financial assets. So there's two main kinds. You have a springing power of attorney and maybe a durable power of attorney. And the way to think about that is that should something happen to you, you become disabled, or you can't make some of these financial decisions, the springing power of attorney sort of springs into action, and that enables this other named person to make decisions on your behalf. And that's fine, nothing wrong with that. The benefit there, of course, is that nobody is acting on your behalf while there's nothing wrong with you. And then there's durable power of attorney, which means that you can make decisions on someone else, even though they are of sound mind. You'll see a lot of married couples have durable powers of attorney on themselves. I happen to with my wife, and because of our relationship, I'm very comfortable with that. I think some of the small challenges that have been out there with the springing power of attorney is, well, is this being contested? Are they really not of sound mind? And how do we prove that and go through that? So that's something to think about as well. But the healthcare directives, the healthcare powers of attorney, it's super, super important. And I will tell you, as acting in my capacity, Aaron, acting in your capacity, I think one of the things that we do, especially when someone has this already created, is we really stress test if the named people are the appropriate people. So I'll give you an idea of what I mean by that, and I'll pick on my two kids. If I think about my older son, he's a people pleaser. If I think about my younger son, he's stubborn. He's a bulldog. He's potentially like his dad. And so if I'm in the hospital, and again, my wife's going to make decisions on my behalf, but if my wife, was no longer around or something like that, a lot of people will name as a backup, the oldest child or one of their kids. And in my situation, I wouldn't name my older child because he would do whatever the hospital said to do. And anybody who has spent time in a hospital knows that it could become a difficult situation in terms of potentially fighting the hospital because their procedures or administrative rules aren't exactly what your wishes are. So making sure that you have the right person that's named, and then making sure that it's up to date on a regular basis. A lot of times you'll see, hey, it's Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe's going to make the decisions should something happen to me. And Uncle Joe died 3 or 4 years ago, right? And there's not a backup in place. And the reality is for a lot of folks, this is sort of set it and forget it.
Yeah.
And the reality is that if you have a financial plan, if you had one created for you, in recent years, it's just a document, right? So the whole concept of wealth management and making sure that you're on track is that it's a process. It's not even, I hate to even say it's a plan because we say it is in our nomenclature, financial planning, but it's a process. It's a living plan. Thank you. And it's an evolution and it changes. And so that's really important. And then finally, on the trust side, I think a lot of folks think about, in general, estate planning is for the wealthy. And I don't think so. I just mentioned it earlier. If you have any assets, you should have a will.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to make sure that you're taken care of financially, if you can't make decisions, you need powers of attorney. We all have our own health to deal with. And if we need to elect someone, that's important. Trusts can save you estate taxes on the federal side, as well as the state side. And federal estate taxes and state taxes are things that are additional taxes that somebody might be subject to should they try and pass down or gift too much in the way of assets above certain thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
But what trusts also do is they give you the ability to control assets from the grave. I'll give you another example, and I'll pick on my family. We are not worried about estate taxes. The estate tax threshold being so high, you'd have to be worth millions and millions of dollars in order to be subject to that today. And things are changing, and we can get into the details on that. But the reason I have a trust in place, one of the main reasons I have a trust in place, is because should something happen to me, and vice versa, or my wife, the assets will go into a trust for the benefit of whichever spouse is alive, where that individual will be able to access those funds where appropriate, live off the income where appropriate. They'll be asset protected as well, should some sort of crazy issue arise. And frankly, it happens more often, I think, from an asset protection perspective than people think it will. Just see crazy stuff where, somebody throws a rock at a bus and,
Mm-hmm.
all hell breaks loose. Or that literally just happened. That's why it's top of mind. But it's also the ability that should my wife remarry, should I remarry, regardless of what happens, my wife and I have already decided what's going to happen in advance and who's going to be the trustee, meaning who's going to ultimately manage the trust and oversee the trust the way we see fit.
Mm-hmm.
And if one of us does remarry and we get taken, right, we get caught up in things, I know regardless, the money goes to my children at the end of the day, because I already have that in place. Nobody can change that. And I think there's a lot of value in that. So whether it's, again, tax protection potentially, or it's ultimately making sure that I protected the assets from somebody else or even themselves. So in a lot of the trusts that we work with today, especially where the kids are younger and everything's great, we all realize that there's some challenges that folks face, whether it be substance abuse, whether it be divorce. I mean, these are excellent ways in terms of protecting our loved ones well in advance of anything happening. And so, again, there is a cost associated with setting up trusts, but I would tell you it is worth tenfold, in my opinion, depending upon the situation. So those are a few of the legal documents you absolutely want to be well aware of, and most importantly, you want to keep them updated. Because I'll give you one more thought here as it relates to the healthcare side. COVID has changed a lot of things, and so there are a lot of folks that might be on this call that have their documents done, that have said, I do not want to live off machines alone. So if I'm by artificial means, and AKA a ventilator and so forth. Well, a lot of us know that throughout COVID, these ventilators saved a lot of lives. And so now people are beginning to rethink that. People are also beginning to rethink, do you remember when COVID was at its height? And in my local area, when my loved one was in the hospital, I couldn't even come into the hospital or sign documentation. Mm-hmm. So how much of this will be accepted by digital means, maybe by email, versus something else? And every state's different. So even if you have an estate plan in place, this is a really good opportunity to have it reviewed.
I agree. Absolutely. I think that is, one of the things that we probably see most common is, like you said earlier, people are, you sit down with clients, you're in a situation, in a conversation, and they say, oh yeah, we took care of that years ago. We've got everything set up. And, like you already spoke to, it is a living, breathing process. It's constantly changing. And, personally, when I sit down with my clients, I like to make sure that this is a conversation we're having on a regular basis. And, one of the things I like to ask at least once a year is, have you had any significant life changes? Have you had anything change within your family dynamics? Do we need to review not only, the estate plans that you have in place, whether it's legal documents, a will, a trust, whatever that may be, but even just the beneficiaries that you're designating on your investment accounts? Let's sit down and make sure that they're all still appropriate, that you still want to have things designated a certain way. Don't be the person who gets divorced and forgets to take the ex-wife off of your primary beneficiary designation and then have to have the kids fight over that one down the road, because I think we've seen that far too often. But so as you mentioned earlier, there's 4 ways basically that assets can pass from one generation to the next or down to your heirs or your beneficiaries. So the first is passing via contract. So that would be a life insurance policy, your retirement plans. These are accounts or assets that are held in your name, and they are passing the way that contract is set up or titled. It may have a payable on death designation or a transfer on death designation, but we are specifically designating or naming beneficiaries that we want to be the heirs, or they receive the benefits of this particular contract that we are putting in place. The next process, or the next possible way it can pass, is through the probate process. Now, as Brian mentioned earlier, if you have a will, a pour over will, people like to throw everything in there, the kitchen sink, and say, everything that I haven't designated, it runs through the will. But what we need to know or keep in mind is a lot of people think that a will help bypass probate. It does not. So if you have a will set up, it's still going to go through the probate process and make sure that you have a court that is appointing or validating basically what the wishes of the will are. So through this process, another thing to keep in mind, having a will give those directives as opposed to possibly a trust. A probate filing or a will filing when somebody passes is public record. So if there is a situation where potentially there are creditors who, if you have a business, or if there's something that could become vulnerable that you want to pass to your children, your beneficiaries, but you have certain creditors out there that they want their, legal rights fulfilled, they want their debts paid off, it is going to be paid to those creditors first. Whatever you have in your estate that's not covered or protected in some way will be passed to the creditors first, and then whatever is left over after going through the probate process is what gets designated to your heirs. So it does open things up to a more public viewing process, I would say. The third way that things can pass is the way that the account is titled or passing by law. So a lot of times for married couples, we will set up an account, an investment account that is titled in joint tenants with rights of survivorship. So you may see acronyms at the end of the account, joint TOD, which basically is just a joint tenants. So if one spouse passes, the surviving spouse is set to take over that entire account, that entire investment asset. They own it in their name alone. And then should something happen to them, if we add a TOD order or designation to it, they've also designated specific beneficiaries to inherit beyond them. So passing by law, the way the account is held, that's the third way that assets can be inherited. And then the fourth is passing through the benefits of having put together a trust. So Brian already mentioned a little bit how trusts can help protect your loved ones, or if you have young children that you want to make sure that they're provided for and taken care of, it really just helps kind of put certain stipulations in place. I had one client who, it kind of cracked me up when they said it this way, but you know, they were very well aware of the kids that they had, and they said, you know, I have one child who, he's a great entrepreneur, he does really well on his own, I'm not worried about him. I have another child that he was born for a trust. So you know, you just sometimes have those people, they know exactly what they need to have set up to protect their kids and sometimes protect them from themselves and making their own decisions. So this is where trusts can kind of come into play. So I know we wanted to talk a little bit more about creating a trust, who's involved with that. I know, Brian, you've had a lot of experience in setting these up as well. Do you want to kind of talk about a little bit behind how they're built and exactly, you know, what is involved with that?
Yeah, and we'll stay at a high level today, so we don't necessarily,
Yep.
the goal of this isn't to make anyone an expert, but just to maybe recognize some of the language. Before I jump into that, you made a great point. I know you're making a joke. Well, maybe you weren't, about some kids. I think you said, you know, this child was born for a trust. There's the other side of that, and just to make sure that this is discussed as well. If there's someone that is going to rely on you for whatever reason, that's just another thing to be thinking about in your overall estate plan. And special needs planning might be one of them, right? Where whether it's a child or an adult or anyone who may need support, could be financial, could be caregiving, could be, I mean, having a conversation around what that might look like is not only really important, but there's a whole additional set of planning that goes into that in order to qualify for some of the state benefits, and in terms of what someone might be entitled to and based on the planning that they might be able to do. And so whether that's through an ABLE account, which is an account that's, you know, for the benefit of folks with special needs, or it's a special needs trust, a variety of different things to think about. But those are important. It's very important that if you're talking to an advisor, that conversation is laid out, and that you make sure that they understand what's important to you as it relates to that. So from the creator of the trust, I think sometimes the legal profession makes this a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. And so instead of giving you one name for the person that creates a trust, there are four here, right? Grantor, settlor, donor, trustor. So ultimately, that individual is the person who effectively sets up the trust. And depending upon the trust, they may name a trustee. And the trustee is just someone who is simply going to make sure that the wishes of the trust, right, of who this person is that's creating it, whatever their wishes are, the trustee has a fiduciary responsibility, meaning they're required by law to make sure that it is sort of followed to a T. Now, sometimes when you have a revocable trust, which really simply means there's no estate planning element to this. This is really, so I have a revocable trust where I am the trustee, meaning I make all the decisions today. Something happens to me, well, my wife and I make all the decisions today. Should something happen to me, it's just my wife. Should something happen to my wife, we have a named trustee. We actually have a corporate trustee, and we can talk a little bit about that too if there's questions on that. And then that trustee is going to be responsible for carrying out the wishes. So whether that's the management of the account itself, right? So those are their assets inside of this trust now. It needs to be managed accordingly. Maybe they're trying to, maybe I've said if something happens to me, I'd like this trust to generate a certain level of income that my wife can use at her disposal, or something of that nature. It doesn't, there really is no shortage of what you can put in there. But the responsibilities as a trustee, a lot of folks sort of just name people, right, without going through a real process. I go back to the guardians. And if you've ever been named guardians for someone, I remember when, my younger brother said, I've done my estate plan and I finally got it taken care of, just like you said. And, should something happen, you and Melissa will take care of the kids. And I'm joking here to some degree, but I already have 2 kids. And I know it is a phenomenal honor, huge honor. And I think I looked at my brother and I said, keep working out, keep taking your vitamins, because I don't need that. But it's something to think about. When you think about who you're going to name, I think one of the things you have to think about, and they have to know, is what potential burden are you putting on them should something happen? And I think most people simply say, yep, got it, appreciate it, what an honor. Well, when you're filing tax returns every year as trustee, that becomes a problem, right? When you're getting phone calls from beneficiaries because they got a case of the I wants, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
You have fiduciary liability. You could be sued by one of the beneficiaries if you're not doing A, B, and C. So there's different ways to structure this and think about this. And I'll just give you one concept. I just referred to it a second ago, this corporate trustee.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to, you can always name a loved one to be that corporate trustee, that friendly trustee, someone you know and love. The only challenge with that is you may leave them with a lot of responsibility in terms of maybe some things that they're not necessarily gifted in or specialize in. The other side of it is you can name a corporate trustee where it is an institution that is managing this all on your behalf. And then finally, there's the middle of the road, which I'm biased towards, where I let the busy work and complicated work be dealt with by the corporate trustee. Mm-hmm. But I also have a loved one as a co-trustee. So effectively, I have 2 trustees. I have the best of both worlds. I have a loved one watching out for the trust. And then I have behind them, I have the people that are going to do the heavy lifting and some of the financial work, so I'm not a burden to them. So those are different things that you might want to think about as it relates to some of these trusts, how they're set up and who's named.
Yeah.
I miss anything, Erin?
I'm sorry?
Did I miss anything? I'm sorry.
No, I think those are all great points. I know that we wanted to make sure, as far as, the word fiduciary, it's a word that gets tossed around a lot in the legal world and financial world. So understanding those responsibilities and the role that goes along with it, fiduciary is just kind of a catch-all for the definition of someone, a person or an entity that is legally and ethically responsible for making decisions in somebody else's best interest, putting the other person's wishes before their own. So I think it's an important point to make, like you said, all of the responsibilities that go along with being designated. And I think it's a great point to make that you can name multiple people. So, we've talked before, if you have one person that, is a child or a loved one or a family member who's very well versed in, healthcare, and they're very comfortable with making medical decisions, you can name one person as your healthcare directive named person. You can name a different person, or like you said, have a loved one as a co-trustee with a corporate trustee for your trust. So I think a lot of people get this thought in their mind that they have to name the same person as the guardian of their children, the one who's making the medical decisions for them, and the one that's handling all of their financial assets. And that's a lot of responsibility to put on a single person. So, splitting it up and making sure you're using your loved ones surrounding you and the professional advisors around you with the strengths that they particularly have, I think is such a great way to have your estate plan set up and really feel comfortable knowing, the person with this particular skill is in charge of making these decisions and so on and so forth. Because when it comes to being an executor of an estate or a trustee of a trust, that is sometimes, a many months long or sometimes many years long process that you're going to be involved in. And so we talked about communication earlier really being the key, and making sure that the people that you're designating in these responsibilities understand what is going to come into play when or if that time comes that they have to step up for that responsibility. One other thing that I did want to kind of make a quick side note on, because we keep talking about trusts and having those put together, part of also having these documents in place and having a professional working with you that you feel comfortable with advising you on all of these and how things are set up is also making sure that you know what is appropriate to designate in a trust and what's not. I recently came across or encountered a situation where we had a husband who passed away, and his employer-sponsored retirement plan had designated his trust as the primary beneficiary before his wife. And so there's something called a spousal continuation, where a surviving spouse can actually take over an account as their own when it's a retirement account like that. And having to go through the process where, when that account was funded into the trust, it makes it more difficult made it more difficult for the spouse, the surviving spouse, to access those funds the way that she wanted, as opposed to just taking them over into her name. So we had to go through an additional process and filing, again, additional legal documents to make sure that this account specifically did get pulled back out of the trust and she was able to take it over in her name. So ultimately, it wound up turning out just fine, but that process took, more finances. It took additional time and a longer process to really allow her the access to those funds. And so, there is a process. Some people think they have a trust and everything needs to get thrown into the trust, and that's not necessarily the case. There are certain assets that you want to make sure are named in the trust. The trust is named the primary beneficiary, and there's other situations where you want it to pass directly to a specific beneficiary for certain tax purposes. So just certain things like that, I think, are just really helpful to know that you're working with those professionals that you feel comfortable with, that you trust, that really have the experience to advise properly on these, and making sure that all of those possible options are being shared and discussed, and you have a good idea of what those strategies are going to look like and any certain implications that go along with them. It's all part of the conversation. It's all part of communicating with your loved ones ahead of time, and then making sure that those wishes are followed through when the time comes that you're not able to share them yourself. So was there anything else, Brian, that you can think of that you'd like to touch on or kind of make sure before we wrap up here?
I think, maybe I'd like to open it up for questions if there's time. And if anyone has any questions, we'd love to answer them. I would share two things with you, maybe two quick takeaways or things to think about, which is, if you have an estate plan today and something were to happen, how quickly could you get your hands on those documents? I think that's the first thing I would think about. They're just give that some thought. And something else I would again share with you is, I think going back to the communication with the family, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a conversation with your children, their adult children, and tell them how much you're worth and everything you own. But even talking about percentages, that, hey guys, 25% of my assets are going to go to this charitable cause, and I want you to know about that now, as opposed to anything else, or whatever that might be. But I think having that conversation is really, really important. And then finally, I guess it's great to have the information, but it's more important, where appropriate, to act on that. And these just, estate planning is a morbid conversation, I think. And so most people don't want to talk about it, but give yourself some space. Think about what you need to do to get in that position to enable yourself to have that conversation. I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Just really quickly to that point, I think one of the things that I try to encourage with clients all the time is, like you said, you don't have to sit them down and share net worth and all the nitty gritty details, but my clients, I've encouraged all of them to have a binder put together. I actually even have a template that they can use that just designates, here's the investment accounts that I have, here's the professionals that I'm working with. So the accountant that I've worked with, the attorney that I've worked with, the financial planner that I'm using, here are the primary contacts to be called in the event of my death. And if you just let them know, hey, I have a binder that spells everything out and tells you exactly where everything is, and here's where the binder is. You don't even have to get into more detail than that if you don't want, but at least let them know that there is somewhere that they can go, that there is a tangible item that they can use for reference when that time comes, and they have everything in one spot. I think it's so important to have that kind of consolidated together.
I love that idea, Erin. I think the key there, and we just keep going back to it, is make sure it's updated, because there are so many changes that are made and things you don't even think about. And one great example is just your digital assets, and I mean your passwords. We live in a very much a digital society, and all those types of things that go along with that. So,
yep, absolutely.
Well said.
All right, so we do not have any questions right now that came through in the chat. What I would like to do, though, before we wrap up here, is just invite anybody who is interested to go ahead and reach out. There's going to be a follow-up communication. It will have all of my contact information in there. So I would love it if you are interested in continuing this conversation. I would love an opportunity to sit down and just do an overview of your current financial plan and estate and give you some recommendations or maybe some thoughts. Maybe everything, like Brian said, is set up the way that you want it to be and you're very comfortable with it, and we can just kind of check it off and say, yep, it's been through a review, everything looks great. Maybe there's some small things that we might want to make changes to, but any questions that we can answer, anything support that we can provide, I would just love the opportunity to sit down with you, have that conversation, and answer any questions that you may have, or even questions that come up if you wind up speaking with your spouse or your loved one later on and you think of something that comes up. Please don't hesitate to reach out. In the meantime, we thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thanks so much. Thanks for being here today, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thank you.